Okay. So. The main files we're going to be working with today are in the resources and icons. We'll be working on bringing in these files either as images or tab icons for our interfaces. We'll be working with this towards the second half of class. And these are just free icons, lift icons. If you guys work on the web, they're pretty popular. There's tons of other resources we'll be using later. This is just a starting kit for us right now. We have some new faces in the class. Allison, Monica, do you introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, I'm Allison. Or is there like a specific?
Just what you do, your current, your development background, what you want to do for the class.
I'm an engineer for General Assembly, so not teaching, but for like the headquarter team, I guess. And my background is I did nonprofit management for a number of years and then career transition to food developer. So I've been full-time at GA since the end of May, and my first like full-time programming gig was last January, started last January. And really hoping to just learn a little bit more about mobile development. We don't do a ton of like mobile stuff at GA yet. It's something that we're all interested in, and I am lucky enough that DC happens to be one of the campuses that's offering one of the first kind of mobile development courses. So this is lucky enough to take it, and yeah, I just want to learn more about Swift and Xcode, etc.
Monica?
Hi, my name's Monica. I have very little programming background. I'm actually, I work for a very small agency under the White House called Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, so I'm a trade negotiator. My background, I have a PhD in sociology, so not much tech, and I'm taking this class because I have some ideas that I want to continue to talk.
Awesome. Great. So we also have Stuart in the back. Stuart, you want to come say hello to everyone? He's filling in for Thomas today.
I'll be your TA today. I'm Stuart. I work over at the Washington Post across the street. iPad developer. I've been doing that since like the App Store opened, probably like 7 years now. Before that, I was doing work in Switzerland with information architects on their Mac IA writer. And before that, I was contracting. I've been programming for like 14 years now. Went in high school. And so if you need any questions, just raise a finger and let me know. I'll come over and help you do something.
Yeah. Yeah, great to have you. Thank you. Cool. Good to have new faces in the class. So yeah, let's sync up, spend just a couple minutes to pull in the repo from upstream, and then we'll get started.
From terminal, it's just get full upstream master.
Mm-hmm. Did you add both origin and upstream?
Yeah.
You forked, and then.
So. Upstream.
And then. Saying.
Yeah. So full, and I got all of this.
Seems right.
Which was slide, but it didn't give me the resources.
So some resources. So yeah, so you edit those right there. Yeah. So can you go into the resources directory and some top research? So for recipe.
Oh.
So that is class specific.
Got a layer down there.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. I'm in technical. It's really question. Just wondering if I get this right. So remember, never click on these. You're always going to be working on your own. Because right here, you're looking at changes from upstream. So I think we covered last time. Yeah, inverses and stuff. So you did one more time? Sure. Yep. Pull from upstream. Cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Thanks. And it also seems that you have made two changes to some PC two over here. So you can sync this up to so it's exactly the same. Does everyone have the new resources, slides for upstream? Awesome. Okay, so how are you guys feeling about getting GitHub? Bit better? How do you feel about source tree?
It's better.
Getting there, yeah. Mary ran into a bug where I also saw this happening last class, where everything was synced up, but it still said there's files that are unstaged. If that happens, if you're going crazy, just quit out of source tree and restart again because it seems that the new version has some caching issues. So if you do see that and you're confident that you've done the right thing, just restart it and see if the change persists or the issue persists. So let's do a quick review before we jump in today. What's CocoaTouch?
It's the framework that Apple uses, but just for their touch-oriented hardware, like iPod, iPad.
Yes, exactly. What's the Mac version of Cocoa? Very good. What's the thing called where we, in Xcode, where we graphically update our interfaces? Storyboard. And then the whole area itself, the storyboard is a file that contains all our screens, right? What's the whole interface builder? Exactly. So interface builder is the graphical interface for editing our views. And storyboard is just one of those files that contains our views. Today we'll be spending a lot of our time in storyboards and making our prototypes a lot more robust. Linking them together, we started linking them last time. Do you guys remember how to link two view controls together? Yeah, control and drag between, what do we drag from and to?
Parents to child.
Yeah, so I heard two. So yeah, you both said that we drag to the other view controller, right? What do we drag from?
A button or something that would create that.
Exactly, yeah. So Ali asked me a question on the street today on Slack. He was trying to link a text field to a view controller, and you can't do that. It's got to be, you kind of can, but not through interface builder, not graphically. So it's got to be object elements that allow us to do that. So those things are like table cells, buttons, menu items, tab bar items, et cetera, et cetera. So items are actually meant to be clicked. Now we can certainly override these through code, but best practice interface builder is they have to be items that are that allow us to do that. Do you remember what the transition is between the two? We didn't go into this in detail. I very briefly mentioned it in last class. The thing that allows us to transition from one view controller to another one. Segue. Very good. Yeah, we'll be covering segues in much more detail today. And then let's do another quick review on getting GitHub. And this will be one of the last ones we do. I just want us to really be comfortable. What is the difference between upstream and origin?
That's yours.
Upstream is yours, origin.
Yes, exactly. Very good. So origin is the one you forked, and is the one that you sync with, right?
Upstream, do you guys have redirect permissions to that, or both?
Just read.
Just read. Very good. What's the process of editing a new file and pushing it to origin?
And
Stage.
yeah, very nice, guys. Making me proud. Okay, awesome. So today we're going to spend a lot more time on storyboards and nibs. I'll go into what nibs are in a second. And this will get us really comfortable in working with Interface Builder and creating prototypes and transitioning our screens together, and then figuring out, positives and negatives of storyboards and nibs, and when, which one you should use when, and then how to kind of interlink the two together. And we're also going to start working with navigation controllers and character controllers. Remember when we did the Intro to XPLS class, we had the ability to select single view applications, tab applications, multiple screen applications. So for our purposes, for the duration of this class, we're always going to start with single view. There's no reason for us to ever select those templates because it's quite easy for us to really create those views ourselves, the functionality ourselves. So I want us to get really familiar and really comfortable in working with Interface Builder before we start jumping into Swift when we come back from our break next year. Any questions? Cool. So last class, we started working on storyboards. Storyboards essentially let us link multiple screens together. And we're going to go into much more detail than today, probably more than you want to know. Nibs is an alternative to that. So there's 3 ways that we can create our interfaces. The first way that we've experimented with is storyboards, obviously. The second way is nibs, that we're going to go over right now. And the third way, which we're going to get a lot more familiar after we get into Swift, is programmatically. And there really is no right or wrong way. It really depends on the situation. Apple really prefers, or they make your life easier if you use storyboards. But there's certain situations where you need to mix them together. You should not be in the lead story one or the other. There's best practices for selecting between building something in storyboards, between nibs and programmatically. Do you have a preference, Stuart, on?
Well, we're pretty much all storyboards, but nibs are good when you want to create something that's purely a view controller, and you don't want to type out the same code every single time with a giant long list of edits of view.
Yeah. Yep. And then with version control, one of the downsides of storyboards, we're going to go over pros and cons when we jump much more detail to storyboards. Version control works in what way? It looks at your files, right? And one of the benefits of version control is collaboration. Well, when you have all your views under one storyboard and multiple work in the same storyboard, it can be tricky. If you have a good process, you can avoid those issues, but theoretically, having multiple people work on one file can be a little bit trickier. And then storyboards, things are not really as reusable. This is where nibs come in. So nibs, we've actually kind of already been partially exposed to them. No need to follow along, just look at my screen right now. If you look on the left side, I can't zoom in because the stupid Yosemite upgrade won't let me zoom in for that. There's a launch screen.nib. So first thing to notice here, I'm pronouncing it as nib, and it's spelled out as XIB. And you're going to see it referenced as both XIB and NIB online. And that's because originally the extension was .nib, and as of the past few versions of Xcode, it's been XIB, but the nib pronunciation still stuck around. So nibs are essentially single views that we can reuse over and over again. So because the introductory screen, the splash screen when we start our application, is something that is self-contained, doesn't need to be recalled from any other view controllers, although it certainly can. That's in a nib. There's no need to have just a splash screen on its own storyboard. So that's a pretty good example of nib. Nibs are, they allow us to work with Interface Builder like storyboards do, but again, we only have one view on a nib. Questions so far?
So the main difference between storyboard and nib is just that the storyboard compiles and combines all those names into the relationship. But other than that,
There's lots of differences, but it's the main difference. Yeah, storyboard gives you lots of views, whereas the nib gives you one main view to work under. One thing to note here, I don't want to dive into too much detail. Both storyboards and nibs have an XML representation. Does anyone know what XML stands for?
extended markup language.
Yeah. So is everyone here familiar with HTML? So it's the documenting markup language for the web, right? So XML is an alternative to that, and it can be used for many things, for passing data around, for documenting things. So these things, nibs and storyboards, if you open them up in a text editor, in a code editor, they all have XML representation of all the elements. So let me open this up just to make the case really quickly.
One of the reasons that we're shared code between different using the and sort of they're all XML and that doesn't work very well.
Yep.
Luckily, in the past like year or two, cut in half size-wise. The old XML was gigantic. Now it's much smaller.
Yep. So I'll open up this nib view right here. And you can actually just, so you guys can write this down. You can right click or control click and then open with. It's going to recommend Xcode, of course, but you can open it in text edit. I'm going to open it in Sublime Text because it'll be easier for us to read. Text edit is a generic Mac text editor. So again, this is all XML, XML attributes and properties and elements. And you can actually, you shouldn't do this, but it's just to prove a point. Seconds, and I have hello world. And if I change this to hello class, you see that updated the nib. Again, don't do this. It's not good practice. But the point is that they're both represented by XML code. Questions so far? So the one element that we've seen so far in our programs is the launch screen. So launch screen nib is the splash screen that comes up when your application launches. As far as nibs go, we'll do a quick exercise now, but we're not really going to reference back nibs for another few weeks because for the purposes of the first half of class, we're going to get through becoming really proficient in storyboards and tying those up to code. And then later on, when we create menus and things of the sort, we'll think about bringing nibs back. So let's go ahead and create a new application and create a nib file ourselves. So can someone walk me through this? How do I bring up the new application? Create new app window. Cool. So we'll go to single view application. And I'll call this nib demo.
Did you leave it on universal?
I'm sorry?
Did you leave it on universal?
I left the universal for now, yeah. We can change that when we create the nib file. So we have the generic architecture here. We have the storyboard, make the storyboard. We have the launch screen, and then the Swift file, which we're going to in this class. So if you go into the Swift file, again, we have a view controller, which we should be kind of used to by now through our very brief exposure. So to create a new nib file, we right-click in our group and select New File. And then the default selected one for you guys should be source right now. Select user interface. And then let's add a view. Now, one thing you'll notice here, we have storyboard options. Our applications can have multiple storyboards, but we're not going to worry about it for quite a while. There's no use cases for us to use it right now. So we'll select the view, and the view is what we call a nib.
Sorry, how did you get to the template?
To the what? So I right-clicked on the group, and I selected new file. And remember, the terminology here might be throwing some of you off. This looks like a folder, right? And we call that groups. We mentioned that last class when we were talking about images. Remember, we were talking about having all images under a group for our organization. How do you guys do it, Stuart? Do you guys use groups or do you use the images? Yeah.
Yeah, just image assets. We try to take up the new technologies that's possible for running new assets.
Yeah, so there's upsides and downsides to using groups versus image assets. The image assets lets you add the different scales of your applications because we have so many different pixel densities for our devices. So when we reference a certain image, that takes care of that for us. Whereas if we have groups, which is where we're going to stick to for now, groups we have to worry about that ourselves. So new file.
Actually, a lot of things with assets, scaling it perfectly.
Yep.
So, maybe it's beyond the scope of this, but could you right click on image assets just as you did before and say new file to create an or is that not work?
Nothing to do.
Okay.
Yeah, so image assets is just a container for images.
Okay.
I wanted to double check here. Nibs, it just goes under your main group.
Image assets like the story.
So I'll call this secondary. So we got our new nib file. Everyone has this in their screen. So this gives us pretty much all the exact same options that Storyboard gives us. One of the main differences is, at least on the interface builder, is that you'll see these icons on the left side, whereas on the Storyboard, they're usually on the top of the view controller. But as far as our object library goes, we can drag and drop anything on there. So let's just add something on here. And actually, let's change our device to just an iPhone portrait. So we'll do the same thing here. I'll do a label, hello world, and the button. So now, if I run my application, let's try it again. We are not going to see this view. That's because by default, you'll see the blank screen that refers to our storyboard. By default, our applications are referring to our storyboards. So we have to manually go in there and tell it to use the nib as our main file or as our reference file or view for whatever functionality we need. So let's take one quick tangent for that. If you go into your main app and go to the General tab, there's a little option here for the main interface. And we'll see that main is the default selected one. And that's referring to the main storyboard over here.
So now it also gives us the option to select our secondary view, our secondary net view.
So if I do that, we'll run it. However, it's not going to default to, it's going to give us a blank screen.
We just did what you told us.
Right?
Still doesn't.
So that's because we have to do a bit more, not too much more, but we have to go in the code and tell it to load this programmatically as well. So for the scope of this class, we're not going to worry about that for now. I just want us to understand what nibs are before we get much more familiar into storyboards and the rest of the views. And I want us to get familiar with the files over here before there's any elephants in the room before we jump into getting more complexities. So again, we're not going to do too much with nibs right now. Later on, we'll be mixing them into our storyboards. I just want us to be aware that nibs exist. They're single files used for reusable elements such as menus, potentially login screens, things that would not necessarily need to be coupled or be part of a flow in a storyboard.
We have to put like a button on the nib to go back to where it came from, or does it just now there?
So
Like if it's a menu and you build a thing and you say, show me the menu for, let's say, a restaurant, and then you pull up this your nib, where do you go back to?
So it depends how the nib is loaded. If the nib becomes kind of the main view, we can dismiss it. But it depends on the use case. A lot of times we can control from other views or from the nib itself. So usually it's from within the nib it gets dismissed because it's self-contained. But there's some other use cases where it can be dismissed from other places as well. Now there's a few upsides to nibs. And again, this is pretty conceptual right now because we're not using them in our applications yet. But they're a bit easier to version. So if you're working with multiple people, you can all be working in a different view and focus on your sole view. They're backwards compatible. Storyboards, although they've been around for a few years now, they haven't always been around. So if you have some very old enterprise application, you might have to use nibs for your functionality. There's cons are it's a lot more difficult for a newcomer to conceptually understand what's going on in the application because the files, they have no visual representation and no visual story of how they're connected. So it makes it a bit more awkward and a bit more difficult to understand what's going on in your applications.
So when you say needs don't stay loaded in memory unless they're being used, does that mean that all your views in the storyboard, like if I have like 5 different screens, 5 different views, they all get loaded when I have first start?
Sort of. I'll go into that in a bit more detail when we go to storyboards. But yeah, so storyboards definitely consume a bit more memory because there's a lot more going on in the background. Now with nibs, a lot of that gets dismissed as the nib gets dismissed. But a lot of times our views become a lot more dynamic. So our actions in our views, for example, they might be tied to another action. In nibs, we have to do a bit more work, although they're more efficient by default in storyboards and memory management. If we dismiss a view that we no longer have an action tied to it, we have to manually and programmatically deallocate that functionality. So although it's more efficient by default, we have to do a bit more manual work when it comes to elements that we have to totally dismiss later on. Stuart, do you have any feedback on that?
It's more or less smaller part of the storyboard. So for the storyboard is you think of like the whole application and going from screen to screen, and nib is could be a little part of that storyboard. So maybe a button is actually in nib. We have other elements inside that button. So create every single time. Plus we use them for images that also have loading bars on top of them. So we don't have to lay out the loading bar and also tweak views with their buttons in there.
exactly. So reusable elements. Buttons is another great example. Menus, buttons, any partial views can be used in nibs and then loaded from within the app at any point.
So one more question.
Mhm.
Does that mean then that I could use multiple needs and combine them to create one screen, or I thought it was no. I thought I had read some stuff that says it'll use multiple.
You can use multiple nibs and yeah. This is more like halfway into the class, but we're going to be using components and controls, and those are essentially those custom views. They can be nibs or they can be programmatically edited on there, but they're essentially reusable views.
So for example, if you have some type of like MP3 player where I want the control buttons to kind of pop up from the bottom, those n symbol of buttons will be in the name, and so I can call them on the bottom now.
Yeah, that's a great example. In the storyboard, they'll be very difficult to do to bring up custom controls throughout the application. If that was a nib or if that was custom code, it could be reused in our storyboards and application.
There's really no correct way to do it when it comes to nibs and storyboards. It's a lot of choice, and there's a lot of people online saying, "Oh, it's people."
Yep. I do have an exercise here, but I'd rather us work on a cooler concept rather than just work on a nib for the sake of working on a nib. I just want us to understand conceptually that nibs are usable elements. They are alternatives to our storyboard views, and we can combine storyboards and nibs.
Is there a representation, you say there's a lack of way to represent graphical relationships between screens. Is there an anchor, for instance, if you're doing the example that he just gave, the MP3 player and the call, is there some kind of a graphical representation of the anchoring programmatically between that stuff that pops up and where it would be on the storyboard, or is that really not work that?
Yeah,
That's
no,
how it would work, it doesn't have published.
yeah, it's mostly you have to programmatically.
Is another way to think of it sort of like a library, sort of like loading a DLL program, or is that not really the same thing?
I can see how you say that. Yeah, I mean it's a reference item. It could be so your application could be a whole bunch of nibs linked together, or it could be a control where you bring to another view. I'm not a reference library. It could be computing. I'll just think of it as a reusable component for now. Like it certainly could be more than that. There's applications that go just on nibs, or a good portion of the views or functionalities of nibs, but it doesn't have to be just. One thing to note is Mac OS X apps. They don't really use storyboards because of the way they kind of work. I haven't built a Mac app in like over a year and a half. Have you, Stuart? Yeah, it's been a while, but they don't really have storyboards because everything is in the context of the current view, and the current view is kind of like your main view unless there's like an options pane, which is kind of another self-contained thing. Because iOS screens are much smaller, its storyboards are much more efficient because they're kind of telling the story as opposed to everything being one main control. So we mentioned menus, reusable templates, setting screens are another great option for nibs, pop-up windows. Can you guys give me any concrete examples from existing apps where we might be using a nib over a storyboard?
Would that be kind of like a warning that pops up, or is it like your battery's low or whatever?
It could be.
Kind of like a little banner.
Yeah, it could be. So like a message represented to a user. Now there's different ways to do that, but this one would be like a consistent messaging kind of template.
I assume this is a nib, but it's the best.
Yeah, yep.
So when you say side menu, is it something like the Gmail app? I think when I swipe my screen, you know, from left to right, then I get that menu that appears, so that I don't need the name.
Yep. Exactly. Gmail, Facebook, when you drag the side screen, that's usually a reasonable one. Yeah. Anything else? Cool. So we'll jump into storyboard. This is where we'll be spending the majority of this class, and we'll be working on our assessment together. So we started kind of playing around with storyboards, and storyboards essentially let us link multiple screens together. It's much easier to understand what's going on in the application, how things are being inherited, hierarchy, how information is passing around. Now, you very seldom use just storyboards. A lot of times you're going to mix storyboards and code and nips. But storyboards make life a lot easier. And in my opinion, you should stick around to using things that are easier to read as much as possible. And Apple is really making, trying to get us to stick to storyboards as much as possible. Especially as of recently, they're making them a lot more powerful. So the way we tie views in our storyboards, this was one of the questions I asked at the beginning of class, was through segues. And there's multiple segues that we can kind of channel. The ones we're going to be worrying about and dealing with are the show and the present modally. There's also custom, which let us add custom animations for the way that we present our screens, our view controllers to our window. And then there's a few other ones, push and modal, which are deprecated. For those of us who don't have programming experience, don't know what deprecated means.
You can still use these in the future, it probably won't be supported.
Yeah, exactly. In the near future, these won't be supported. They are supported right now. When we create our segues, you will be able to select these segues, but maybe a year, maybe two down the line, these will no longer be part of the flow.
Does that mean that because you know there's also like functions that push view controller stuff like that. Does that mean that that part is deprecated as well?
Which one?
Well, you know, when you programmatically tell one view control, for example, to load another one.
No, that won't be deprecated. Yeah, that's part of. You're asking me about programmatically. So right now we can tie up buttons and actions to our view controllers. Remember, we did the click and drop, click and drag. We can also do it through code, and there will be lots of instances for us to do it through code. So think of it this way: you know, say you have a storyboard and you have a login screen, and you want to go to our main content screen, and our login button takes us to our main content screen, but the login is not correct. We don't want to allow the user access to go to grab the rest of the content, right? So there's no way for us to do that through Interface Builder. We have to do that through code. And Alexa's question was, there's a function, a method that we can call that's actually called, that has the push keyword in there. And his question was that programmatic way of doing that going to be deprecated? And the answer is no.
So the deprecation is only for storyboard.
For the Interface Builder, yeah. Now, maybe the method might change. I don't know if you know anything about that, but as of right now, it shouldn't.
Show and push are almost the same.
Yeah.
Just supersedes and replaces anything I always say it's doing.
Yep.
Yeah, all of them, modal is gone, push, popover is gone, but it's really modal to show detail or present modal and popover is present a popover.
Could you give us an example of what show looks like in a common app?
We'll do that in just a second. I'm going to go next code. That's basically, there's an animation difference. Show essentially is not like push, so it pushes things horizontally, and model brings things from the top of the bottom.
So can't you change the animation?
You can. Now the way we do it through Interface Builder are through these two, but if you go custom, you can change the way that those views are presented. Any questions before we jump into a demo and then an exercise? Cool. So
For this demo, we're going to do a few things. We're going to build a bit more complex storyboards where we have quite a few view controllers linked to each other. We're going to get familiar with navigation controllers. So where we have navigation on the top of the screen, where by default, Apple has the back button when we go through views. And then we're going to go through our tab controllers, which essentially gives us icons with tabs at the bottom. And that's where we're going to add our images, our icons to our tabs. So let's go ahead and fire up Xcode and create a new project. So for the next couple weeks, I'm going to keep doing things the visual way, but I want us all to get familiar with shortcuts. So a couple weeks down the line, I'm just going to do new file, new projects, do command, shift them, and I'll keep saying the shortcuts as we work with them over the next week. But I want us to get really familiar with doing the shortcut keys. Thomas posted a great shortcut reference, and we'll keep updating it to the course as well. So I'll call this storyboards demo. And let's just go ahead and make this an iPhone app for now, so we don't have to worry about auto layout and our constraints. Quick pop quiz question: does anybody remember what constraints are? Sort of. So those are blue guidelines, and they guide our constraints. Constraints are relationship of our items between our main window and the other items. And the blue guidelines right now, we want to get used to using them because if we use them, Xcode makes pretty good suggestions for us. Cool. Save our new app. Let's go into our storyboard. Now, we'll see this very quickly as we add more views. Storyboards can be a bit of a pain if you're not working on a large screen. If we have like 20 different view controllers on our screen, we have to zoom out. And Apple gives us the ability to zoom out in our interface builder. I know the short key, so I don't even remember over here where we reference it from. But if we're if I go into our editor, and then Canvas, thank you, and zoom. So remember these shortcuts? It's Command, Shift, Alt, and then the brackets. That's what the squiggly brackets. So we can zoom in and out of our interface builder. So this makes it a bit easier if we have a lot of screens and a lot of things going on in our storyboards to see the relationship between our screens. So again, Command, Option, Shift, and then square bracket left for zoom out and square bracket close for zoom in.
Option shift, you said?
Command, Option, Shift, and then the square bracket left, square bracket open to zoom out, and square bracket close to zoom in. It's a lot of. You can also reconfigure these under Xcode preferences.
Kind of like one side down.
Continuous zoom doesn't stop at a certain point.
I'm sorry?
It's like a continuous zoom, it doesn't stop.
Yeah. It's like an animation. So you just press it once and then
Because if you keep doing it,
It keeps going, yeah.
can you control that?
No, just how I explain this. Did you press a lot of times, and is it still?
Just
Also, one thing to note is animations are also pretty CPU, GPU intensive. which means that you might experience more lags. More lag when zooming in and out.
You turn the animation off.
I don't know if you can. Can you turn it off? No, yeah, it's a default. Yeah.
You right click and do the percentage is still animated.
I doubt it. It's gonna have to.
Animate the three.
Yeah. I'm used to just using the shortcut keys all the time. One thing to note here is when you zoom out, because I'll be doing this for the demo, you can zoom back in just by double clicking on the view controller.
You have to zoom in sometimes to do certain operations.
Yep, exactly.
Lockers and
So let's go ahead and add another view controller to our view. And let's also add some context to all this. So let's create a book, and I'll call this, let's add a label. And we'll call this mob book. Let's go ahead and change the font a little bit.
So what's the difference between
Label and what?
buttons?
So remember I mentioned everything is kind of a bunch of elements combined. So a button does have a label inside. A button has an action, whereas a label doesn't have an action by default. So we're gonna make this very simple. Let's also add a button. And we'll say start reading. So how do I link between this first screen, this first view control, and the second one? Control drag, right? So we've done this so far. And we see the options for show and present modally and custom, and we see that we have the other segues that are deprecated. So we're not going to be using these for the purpose of this class. We'll stick to primarily show and present modally, at least for the next, at least 5-6 classes.
So when you do that, so Xcode is gonna write some code in the background, right? To link those two and to say this is show and stuff. But you can't see that code when you link on your view controllers or your ability. You don't see that code, right?
No. However, you can intercept the code. So whenever we add, so let's go ahead and do the segue really, and I'll show you what I mean. So right now, I'll just do a show. So these segues, and again, one thing to note here is you see this icon, and the kind of segue and kind of animation we select, the segue icon here changes based on what we select. So Alexia's question was, whenever you do a drag and drop from here to here, some code executes in the background, right? So the question was, can we not see that and do anything with that? Whenever we add a segue, our segues also become our own objects, and they also have our own identifiers. So we can actually reference our segue IDs in code.
Because you might want to do something automatically based on that segue.
Exactly. Exactly. So the segues become very important when we go into code, and it's also going to become important for us to have an identifier for our segues later on. For the purpose of this in a class where we're focused on interface builder and UI, we don't need to have an identifier for these. But later on, whenever we have conditional logic and we tie in our interface builder to our code, it's going to be important to add an identifier to our segue.
So could you have one button pushing to multiple view controller, but then, I mean, depending on the level of condition, it pushes one or the other.
Sort of. There's, without getting too deep in, because we're going to start covering this in a couple classes, there's best practices and there's issue question as to why you should go to one or the other and whether that one should just dynamically present a view. But wait a couple classes for that. So let's also add a label to this view controller over here. I'll actually just call this chapter 1. So one thing you'll notice here is I change the size. You'll see that the label starts getting this trail over here. Now, if you just click on the corner, it'll resize itself. With labels, you should never give it an exact width because labels are flexible. There's something called an intrinsic size. An intrinsic size means that it's basically a flexible size dependent on the content. So things like labels, where the content might change, you never want to give them exact width. You never want to set a width for them. So I just clicked on the corner over here, and it resized it itself. I didn't drag it. I just clicked it. So I just clicked on the corner. Just one single click.
Once you resize it,
Yeah, once you resize it. So if you undo that, did you resize it initially?
Yeah,
Or?
I resized it so I see it and then 3 dots. But then when I click on that, now I go on. Like inclined line.
Is it? If you see actually why Alex's label is not resizing.
So.
Teddy, it works if you hold down command.
If you hold on command? Okay. Yeah, try and hold on command. It should work if you just click
I
it.
think today you said that it automatically resizes itself.
Yeah, try and hold on command. That's a good point, man.
Command.
Thanks, Ed.
It's
So-
happening again and again to me too.
If you put it in a simple view, then you get
If I
the
think
same
it's
result.
simple, we go over here. And then I ask, like, you're not having the same problem.
What's the problem?
And then I call the label, go over to the view. If the view's gone, the label's back, I don't know.
So let's also add a button while we're debugging that to our second view. Let's actually add 2 buttons. Do you remember how to quickly copy an element on our interface builder? I'm sorry? Option and drag, exactly. So hold on Option and drag your element. So let's make the left one go to previous, and the second one go to next page. So let's make it so the left button is labeled as previous and the right one is labeled as next.
You aligned it.
You mean these?
Mock book and chapter 1, or do they just?
No, it doesn't matter. For the purpose of this, it doesn't matter.
You can make it live.
And let's also add another view controller next to our chapter 1. Right here. And this will be chapter 2.
I'm not
And let's do a push to this one as well. So let's make it so the next button goes to chapter 2.
All these connectors are push.
Yes. So I want to add more space here so we can view our segues. And on chapter 2, let's also add a button that takes us back. So we'll make this previous. So let's also make it so our next button takes us to chapter 2. And we'll make this a show for now.
I selected push. So how do I change?
Oh, so that's actually a good point. If you want to undo, you can do Command Z, or you can select the segue and just press delete. So again, these are actual objects in our storyboards that we can reference. So you can select them and delete them just like normal elements. Yep.
I edited on this side.
Edit the.
Change the title.
You can, yep. So great question. So if you select the segue and select, go to your attribute inspector, you should see a seg label right here. You can actually override that or reset that to another type of segue.
Was there a segue from previous to?
Not right now, not yet.
Why not?
Yeah. So we'll just make sure that this runs. One thing to note here, it's kind of a sidebar, it's kind of a program best practice. As we're building our applications and as we keep adding logic, you never want to just write code or just add stuff on screen for like an hour without checking it. You want to continually run your code and check your interfaces to make sure that it aligns and meets your expectations. If you develop code or write, even work with interface builder for next amount of time, you might get a bug or things might not look right, and it'll be very difficult to go back in time and tweak what you want to tweak. It might affect everything else. So make sure that as we write our applications, even through interface builder, we continually check, compile, and check. This is where Playgrounds also becomes very helpful because that rule applies much more when we actually program it. So it's a bit more cumbersome after our applications get large and we want to check functionality to compile and run. So Playgrounds let us check lines of code without having to compile every time. But it's very important for us to get in the mindset of always checking our code and checking what we're building before we spend a prolonged amount of time building it. Yep.
How did you build the next question? Like, how did you create a box around it?
Oh, there's the box.
Oh, there's no box. I have a select. I selected a segue.
Oh yeah.
So when you select the segue, it also selects the highlights the items that triggers a segue.
Yes. And all segues are show right now.
Yes, they're all shown.
I guess it's in your segue.
So right now we only have the next buttons working. So let's run this, and just to make sure things are working properly.
It's funny because it pops on the bottom, but
Yeah, we'll go over that in a second. So let's change, just for the purpose of demo here, for the first one, I want to change the segue from a show to present modally. And run this again. This also does it for the bottom.
the show present model and however doesn't it all have to do with ownership like
It's with hierarchy, yeah, that was the point. So right now there's no real hierarchy between these. This is just transitioning to the other ones. So they're all showing, even though they're show, they're all appearing from the bottom right now by default. When there's going to be a bit more hierarchy and framework around our applications, these are going to become much more relevant, the animations. But before we go into that, I'm going to go back to show. Let's also tie up our previous buttons to our previous views. So we'll do the same thing. We'll drag and drop from previous to the last view controller. So from chapter 2, previous goes to chapter 1, and we'll show. And previous from chapter 1 goes to the intro screen, we'll show. And it's starting to get a bit messy. Squiggly lines.
Now, what does that do in memory? So, because I remember reading, you know, like if you think about the views as being a stack, so you keep stacking cards on top of each other, right? And then you pop them out of view. So you go back to the bottom of the stack. So basically, when you first start the application, you just have one card, and as you push other cards or show here, they keep stacking on top of each other. So if I keep on show, does that mean that I keep like stacking like huge amount of cards on top of each other?
Not when it comes to independent view controllers. When you tie them to things like navigation controllers, that stack is a much more appropriate analogy. So when you have the navigation controller, and we'll go over that in a second, and that's a good transition for that. That's going to be kind of the base of the deck. And then when you go between those view controllers that it owns, that's when the deck is going to be a much more relevant analogy. Now, in terms of memory, it's pretty damn good at deallocating things. So that's not something that we usually have to worry about.
So you don't need to. So basically, Xcode will just keep whatever amount of past views it deems necessary, and then it will start deallocating those things when you're
Yep.
So here there's no hierarchy between those three views. Right? You could say there's no view that's higher than the other.
No. Now it's just one view being present versus the other ones not being active at all.
Why do they call them view controllers and not screens?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a hard question.
Yeah, it's a very
That's a Steve Jobs question.
There's such an excellent question.
Let's go do the Starbucks.
No, so that's actually a really good question. I think it's good for us to take a tangent because we'll start covering this in much more detail next week. But basically, the Apple gives us we work in a MVC kind of framework. So MVC stands for Model View Controller, and the way that works is we have the view. So the view is what we're working on right now, right? Then we have a model. And then we have our controller. So the way this usually works is we have three pieces of entities, three entities that exchange information with one another. The view is, of course, our graphical representation, right? What the user actually sees. The model is where we usually store our data, or we have our business logic. So this is really the meat of what happens in the background. And the controller is what passes information between these two and between other views as well. So the controller, without jumping too far ahead, we have a view controller over here, right? So this gets a bit confusing because our views here are called view controllers, but our file is also called view controller. And all this is right now is nomenclature. By default, our view is tied to our view controller. So our view controller over here, view controller in Swift is this. So this is view controller. Our view is our object view controller. And we're not even worrying about this right now. We're not going to be worrying about this for a while. But this is a view controller
philosophically speaking, because it's a view that is tied to a controller. Remember how I said last class that everything is a view? So our label's a view, our button's a view, and then our view here is a view, right? So this is the parent view, but it's a view controller because that's the way I think it is, because it's tied to a controller over here. Alexia.
So those three screens, right? I mean, they look like screens. That would show up three different screens on your
Sure.
iPhone. Again, we could have created them programmatically, and then what would happen is on the bar, on the left bar, we would have three view controller 1, view controller 2, right? But since we did that in the storyboards, as you're saying, like the code is created in the background, so we don't have those files that show up.
No, but you can also create all those from one view controller. And I'm confused by some of the deep in that. You have the option of one or the other. It's just a matter of how you wanna group your software and present architect your software. But you can have all of these from one controller, one controller to sweat file. Does that answer your question?
Because I thought maybe it's another one of those things that it's just like, people say you should do that, but I thought they said one view controller should just control one view, like one screen.
Yeah, that's best practice.
99%. So,
Yeah.
And if you want to do anything more fancy, you would have 3 classes, 3 controllers.
Yeah, because here they're pretty similar, but what if they were like, one has like 20 buttons and the other just has like a list and a picker or something like that. So here you would create 3 different
View controllers.
Yeah.
But they can, again, best practice is to have their own controllers, but they can all tie to one if necessary. Again, everything is very flexible, which can be a bit confusing, but best practice is that they do have their own controller file. Any questions on that? Right now, we're going to go into that in much more detail after we get more familiar with Swift and the actual controllers. So right now, there's obviously relationships between these things, right? As we have a previous button and a next button, and this is getting a bit hairy because we have things linking between one another, right? And if we present something else modally, we could also let's actually do that. Let's add a model view. Let's do a view controller. And I'll add this to the bottom. So going back to Stuart's point, let's also, I'll demonstrate why we can't add things zoomed out. So let's add a label to our new view controller. You'll see that it won't let me add anything when it's zoomed out. We have to actually be zoomed in into the appropriate view controller to be able to add and manipulate items inside it. So does anyone remember how to zoom into a specific view controller? Double click the tab bar. So we'll just use our imagination here and say this is our bookmark view. And let's also add a button from our chapter 2 view controller that says bookmark. And this one should take us to our bookmark view controller.
It's a show.
Sorry, make a model. So present modeling. So let's run our application one more time. Present modeling. So we start reading, go to chapter 2, and then bookmark.
So right now, there's no real clear difference between our show and present modally segues, right? And this is also pretty cumbersome right now because we have things pointing left and right, and later on maybe our transitions and segues might get a bit more complex. But for the purpose of this, there's no real reason for us to have these things crisscrossing or our segues crisscrossing just for the purpose of going back. So this is a really great example for us to add a navigation controller. So a navigation controller essentially helps us manage our views when they are clearly linked to each other. So a book or a multi-step form or whenever you have things that have hierarchy between one another. So whenever you have a user profile and then a photo and then an edit, you always, going back in the context of those views, always goes back to that previous view, right? So this is a great example for that as well. If we have a book, we have view controllers transitioning right or left, right? It's a pretty one linear transition, right? So that's instances where navigation controllers are super, super useful. So before we do that, let's go ahead and remove this previous button functionality. Let's select our previous. Let's actually remove all segues between these main screens. So remove by segue. Back and forth, yeah. So now when our application runs, what happens?
You just load the first screen and then you click on the button.
And nothing happens, yeah. So these screens are irrelevant right now, right? Because there's nothing that's taking us there. And one more note, if I want to make this second screen my first screen,
You're changing the interface. Say whatever the name of that screen is.
yep. So we changed it in our interface builder as well. Actually, there's a few ways to do it, but the easier way is this arrow over here. We can actually drag it to our other view controller. So this lets us actually start our application with this screen. So we'll go back to the first one. So we're not, if we have our application and our first screen is something that we don't want to be our primary view, it's very easy for us to reallocate our views or rearrange our views. Again, another benefit of storyboards is it makes that the visual representation of that very easy to understand. So let's resume to what we were talking about, navigation and having context behind linking our screens. So the way that we add navigation to our view controller is, let's actually zoom in. You can select the view controller. And at the top, under editor, we can select embed in and navigation controller. Yeah. So you select the view controller and then editor, embed in, and then navigation controller. Now we can also add a navigation controller from here and point to that. The easier way of doing that is because you always start an item with navigation. You always have a navigation controller that belongs to something else, or that owns other elements. So the easier way of doing it is just to select the view controller that you want to start. You want to be at the very roots of your navigation and embed that view controller in a navigation controller. So whenever we have a navigation controller, we have just a blank screen that says navigation controller, and we don't actually do any work here. This just lets us know that our next view that it's pointing to is going to be embedded in navigation controller. Questions on that right now?
The navigation controls, that's a new window, right? Or a new scene that was just created when you clicked on
Yes.
It's not what you originally put on.
No, no.
So something was created and put in front of it.
Exactly. So the other way to do it is to actually select navigation controller here, drag it, and then point it to your view. The way I usually do it, and then most people do it, is select the view controller and embed in. Do you have a preference to it? I mean, usually just embed. Yeah. And you also notice that the segue looks different than our other segues, right? So you see, whenever we edit our navigation controller, our view controller here also got a nav bar at the top. So let's run this really quickly just to see what's happening in our app before we start linking it together. So again, we have our nav controller, and nothing really is functioning right now, but we see that it's present right now. So nav controllers usually have two primary functionality. They have usually a button on the right for taking us to the next view, although not necessarily, and then a back button in the context of the current hierarchy. So the back button takes us back to the previous view that we came from. So there's always context when things are linked together in navigation controllers. Alex used the great analogy of a deck of cards. The way that works is the navigation controller is kind of like the bottom of the deck, and it controls what card comes to the top. And everything is tied together kind of in a linear fashion. So initially, this is the top of our deck. If we have it on the screen and we click the button or touch the button to take us to the next screen, that other screen goes on top of our deck and becomes the active screen. So the back button always has context as to which one was the previous one. So it shuffles things back and forth. So let's see how this happens visually here. So let's tie up our start reading with our chapter 1. And let's select show.
You can actually stop the simulation, or you don't need to.
You don't need to. You can. Remember the shortcut to stop it?
Command period.
Yep. Show. Yep. So when we select show, you'll see that our next view now by default also inherits this navigation bar, right? And let's also go ahead and tie up our next button for chapter 1 to chapter 2. And let's again do show. And you will see that this also inherited this navigation bar. So I'm going to run this before we move on, so we can get some context on what happens. So if I click on Start Reading, we now get this back button in our navigation controller. So there's context as to where this view controller came from. And if I go next, there's also a back button on this one. So we always can go back and forth between our views. And our navigation controller gives us context as to which one was a previous view. Going back to the stack of cards, it knows that what's underneath this one is the previous view.
So a navigation control is basically an organizing tool based on the segues that you create.
Yeah.
Right? And then it creates back and forth. There's no forth, but back.
Yes.
Is there the opposite of that? The next button?
Yeah, so the next button we have to do ourselves. So right now, let's stop this. Right now, our buttons over here are acting as our next buttons, right? So we should be able to drag our next button to our navigation controller, right? But you see it's hiding back there. It's because our navigation controller has hierarchy command. There's another item we can add to actually add a button to our navigation controller. So let's go ahead and, again, refactor our interface builder segues. So let's go ahead and remove our segues. I'm also going to remove the next button here and the previous button here. So again, we once again have no relationship between our view controllers. So I'll connect the start reading to our main one just for now.
I'm sorry, you deleted the nav control.
No, just the next and previous buttons over here. So let's actually go ahead and re-add the start reading to our chapter 1. So over here, we want to have our page switching at the top, right? So the back button appears by default from our navigation controller. So we want to add a button to our top right by default. Has everyone seen this in iOS apps where we have a next and then a previous up here, right? So it won't let us add a button because of the navigation controller hierarchy. But there is an item that we can add to our navigation controller that's called a nav bar button. Or bar button item.
Nav item, right?
Bar button item. So this one lets us actually add the button to the top right of our screen.
Why did you do that? Oh, because it's the bar button item, so it's probably that button.
No, that's the right one. What is going on? That's code.
Oh, it's the bar button.
Is anyone else having issues dragging this to the?
Yeah, it drags it at the bottom.
It brings it to the footer.
Yeah, it should have. Bar button item. So this one right here.
Yeah, that's represented item.
Yeah, bar button item. Give me 1 second. That's really strange.
Yeah, you know, they have the bar.
What's that?
Mine
yeah.
worked only when I added it to the Bob book page of the chapter 1.
Is it inherited all the way down?
No. So this is our. Okay, so when I'm selecting the push segue. Huh, that's really weird. I think it's an Xcode bug.
It's
Is
not adding the navigation item for you. For
Yeah.
some reason.
I think it's an Xcode bug. So what I did was I selected the segue over here, and I went from show to push, and then back to show. That's really weird. I think it's a Xcode new Xcode bug. Like yes. Yeah, there's tons of them. So select the segue and go from go from show to push, and then back to show. Really stupid. That will hopefully be fixed in the next Xcode version. I haven't had that happen before.
How did you know that you knew that? You just encountered it before?
No, I haven't encountered it before. No, I know it worked with push in the past. So,
What, from show to
so I selected segue, and I went from show to push, and then I went back to show.
you know push is deprecated.
Yeah, I'm not sticking to push. The reason I did that was just so I could go around Xcode, but no logic behind it. My brain just kind of told me to do that. So let's rename our item to next page. Yeah. So if you remove it, and then select the segue, and then under Attribute Inspector, select push, and then go back to show. Yeah, sorry guys. We're gonna, throughout this class, it's gonna be frustrating, but we are gonna encounter other bugs. This is not the only one we're gonna come across. So we just have to get used to, things happening. And this especially happens whenever Apple releases a new version of Xcode, or a new major release. Like for example, Xcode 6 beta had like a zillion
errors. It was. Did you ever work with the beta version?
Yeah, we try not to.
It was really, yeah, it was really, really frustrating. It just happens. We don't really have much control over it. Allison?
Actually, I have a question. So, I've heard from folks that like every new Xcode version breaks different things. So, as like throughout this class, as we get Xcode updates, should we install them or should we wait until you tell us to install them? What should the process be?
Let's install them. Let's, yeah. Let's keep
Okay.
installing them.
Break things.
It
Yeah.
only really breaks Swift these days, because Swift is so in flux, every day it changes, every update it changes.
Got it.
Yeah, updates to Swift are usually bug fixes. This is, yeah, I haven't encountered this in the past, but I think it's a good exercise for us to update and just get familiar with debugging stuff and figure out if it's something we're doing or if it's an error. It's a good process to go through.
Okay.
That works. Cool. Any questions on this so far? This should not have been that complicated.
So do we have to still tie the screens together with segues despite the fact that, I mean, in other words, I just ran it, the next page does not.
Yeah, so we still have to tie the next page to the next screen. However, we don't have to tie a previous page. Let's go ahead and tie the next button to the next view controller. Yep, show. So let's run this.
Should I ask now, or are you gonna explain later the differences between the segues? The show detail, model.
Yep.
Did you do that when I was?
We started, but I'll explain in a second. So leave it as is, and we'll go over it in just 1 second. So let's go ahead and run our application.
What was the shortcut for running it again? Running R.
Command R.
Sorry, Command R.
So start, take us to chapter 1. We can go back. Next page. So now we have context between all of our screens. Questions so far? Bless you.
I just, so we should have just, almost, this part, deleting the previous text buttons that we already have.
Yeah, remove those together, altogether.
So has a clear order been established here, or is it just know that one is after the other? In other words, is chapter 2 the third item, or is it just the one that happens to be after chapter 1?
It's the one that happens to be after chapter 1. That's a very good question. Yeah. So there's always context as to what card gets brought up to the top based on user actions. So let's actually add a button here and just prove that point. So I'm gonna change the previous button here to go to beginning on chapter 2. And let's control drag that to the first screen. And we'll show. Right, so we have first screen, take us to the second, take us to the third, and the third can either go back or can go to the very beginning. So now, if you run this, start reading, next page, go to beginning, back always has the context of the previous page that brought it there. So it's again, it's a deck of cards. Whenever something gets presented, it goes to the top, right?
How do you drag from chapter 2 back to the start?
The same way, just hold control, and then you drag it to the first screen.
Yeah, but it's hard because it's off the screen.
It's up the screen, yeah. Yeah, and this is what I was talking about. Storyboards is a bit of a pain in the butt. If you have a lot of screens and you don't have a big screen to kind of have context span and everything to zoom out with.
Yeah, we should all bring our big screens to class. So that was actually an excellent question. Let's remove that segue for now. So I'm going to remove the go to beginning altogether, just for the next point. And let's also remove the segue between bookmark and this other view controller over here. So going back to show, we now see that because there's a relationship, our views are pushing horizontally, right? Again, that can be changed. That's just the default Xcode gives us. So for the bookmark, this is going to be our bookmark page. We bookmark our current view, right? Let's let's drag from our bookmark button to our bookmark view controller, and let's go over presenting this modally. So select present modally. So what's the difference here? Yeah, there's no bar at the top. So this model is, because it's not a show, it's not part of the overall linear hierarchy. It's something that gets presented just in its own context. Therefore, it doesn't get added to the top of the deck. It gets added to the top of the screen, but the deck still stays as is. It just now has this temporary wildcard on top of it.
We're going to think of models as being in the application. Models have their own separate mode application. It doesn't really high level on iOS, but it's where the term comes from.
Yep.
Sort of like a notification.
Yeah. Yeah. Or preferences, or temporary one-off page.
So I removed my navigation control, but no, I don't have an arrow, which is the navigation control, as I added it back. So whenever I load my application, it's a black screen. So how do I?
So you removed your navigation controller?
Yeah, that problem with it. So I don't have that first arrow leading to navigation control. So how do I get it?
You can just control drag from navigation controller to window.
No. The very first arrow on the left, that says
One
hey, the
should-
navigation control is the first.
Yeah.
Since I removed the navigation control, I don't have an arrow that leads to the
The arrow should have defaulted to something else if you did that.
You have to mark the one you want as the initial view controller in the inspector. So if you click on the one you want there to go to,
So this,
and then in the inspector there should be his initial view controller. Like,
this,
right in the middle.
these initial. Okay.
Kind of like my-
What happens if you didn't do that? And you run, would it just not start?
It's just black.
A black screen.
So now one thing we have to be wary about is we have a model showing from an item that belongs to our navigation controller. However, if I go back to our bookmark and add a button here and say dismiss window, and go back to our previous screen, right, to this screen, and we'll do show. Let's run this and see what happens.
We went from dismiss window back to the.
To- Back to this one that brought it, that showed the model, the bookmark, to the.
So the dismiss window to back to the chapter 2, it should be a show segment.
Yeah. With the big old squiggly lines. So let's run this and see what happens. So we start reading, next page, bookmarked. And you notice the transition is different, right, for the model? So now if we dismiss and go back to our,
You don't have your navigation.
we don't have our navigation control anymore. That's because it changed the flow of the page. And the way that we dismissed models is there's a way to tie them up. You see, there's actually a few ways to dismiss models. And you see there's an exit icon over here that you could tie it to, but we do have to add some code. So for today's context, we're not going to worry about that. But the way we dismiss models is we don't drag and drop to the previous screen if there's a flow between the previous screens.
So just trying to understand here. So when, in terms of the screens that load in memory, right? So when I first when I first launched my app, I had that navigation controller, right, which is basically on top, and then right under it, I have my mug book, right?
Yep.
And then I click on start reading, so I have that mug book, whatever gets pushed in the background. I have another card that pops up in chapter 1. I click again next chapter, same thing. So now I have mug book under chapter 1 under chapter 2, and then I click on bookmark. I have bookmark that basically covers the entire screen now, but I still have those 3 there.
Yeah, so
if I click on dismiss window, I have a parallel universe chapter 2 that pops up on top.
So what you're doing is you're actually the card deck analogy only applies to relationships like navigation controllers. So navigation controller is a deck of cards, but everything else is not part of the deck of cards.
Okay.
So when you add a model and you do a show from that model to another screen, you're pulling it from deck of cards and you're putting it over here, but deck of cards is still down here.
Okay. So basically, I took my chapter 2 card and then I put it on top.
Yeah.
So I didn't create a second one.
Yeah. So the model is not part of deck of cards, it's its own thing, and you're pulling another card down randomly and adding it over here. Yeah.
Okay. So you cut out the relationship with the rest of the
Yeah.
Because I was worried about. I remember some guy who obviously doesn't know anything to programming, but they kept on creating new windows using model view controllers, and so I was like, don't you run into some type of memory problem at one point?
You're very good. Yeah. Any more questions on this? So navigation controllers are, I like Alexis's analogy, it's exactly like a deck of cards, right? Just push these things to the top, and whatever you grab and push to the top, it's part of that whole deck of cards. Deck of cards being all these things that are linked together, gets pushed to the top, and it remembers the last one because there's an actual physical analogy. There's actually a really cool tool I want to show. I want to bring next class called Reveal. Do you ever use Reveal? Is it built in? So basically, you can see the hierarchy between everything, but in a 3D interface. And this happens sometimes too.
Reveal will take your current app and blow it up into every single view and put it in a 3D space so you can see it.
Yep.
So you can see where the labels fall and side of the view where the buttons fall.
For example, everything we're doing right now, is it automatically saved?
Yes. Whenever you do something, it saves it.
When you run it,
Because to me, these view hierarchy are the most difficult conceptually to understand. Because I'm always worried about having my app work fine when I do 2 or 3 windows, but if you had the user who works with like 15 windows or something like that, maybe I want to do some type of like memory overload and then crash it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very real thing. If you don't have logic behind the way you present things, it does happen. That's why it's important to get these fundamentals down.
So what about the page view, like the template? So rather than with a single view, but there's also the page view.
Yeah, we're going to cover that in a few classes. Right now, I want us to get the basics down of these. Yeah, that can get a lot more complex. But that's a great question. So there's one more kind of relationships between our scenes I want us to get familiar with. So right now we have navigation controllers. One of the options we have when we create a new project is a tab bar. So if you go to File, New, no need to create anything. We see that the option is a tab application, right? And remember when we created it last class, we got one main view kind of similar to a navigation controller that had, I think, like 3 default tabs, right? So we can also do this through our application very easily. Let's right now go ahead and remove all of our segues. And also go ahead and remove the, or if you want to keep it as notes, save it, and create a new project. I'm also going to remove the bookmark. And I'm also going to remove the navigation controller.
So you can do the bookmark, you can hold.
Yeah, I removed one as well.
I'm gonna drag that first arrow off.
Yeah.
Control.
Yeah. Make sure, yeah, you can undo that and make sure you drag this to the first view. Otherwise, it'll remove it. And you'll have to go into your attribute, into your right sidebar instead of your initial view.
Can I start a tab application project or whatever you're doing?
No, let's get familiar with doing it this way. Then you can do it another.
Oh, so you're gonna just pull it as an element from down.
Exactly. Everyone have something like this? So just like we embedded a tab bar view, we can actually do select our first view controller, click on editor, and then embed in and do tab bar controller. And this looks somewhat similar to our navigation controller.
That first arrow.
If you undo it, you can just drag it there, or you can go into your right sidebar and yeah. So one thing to note with navigation items or tab bar controller is it's a little bit different than navigation view controller. The navigation view controller was kind of a process of getting from one screen to another. So we have, for example, a main page, a profile page, a photos page, and the relationship is linear, right? Almost. The tab bar controller, the screens they're still kind of like a deck of cards, but the use case for them is much more kind of like self-contained. So you'll notice that the tab bar controller added a bottom bar as opposed to the top bar. And let's also tie up our other screens into our tab view controllers. And the way I'm going to do this, just for making things easier to visualize, I'm going to drag them vertically next to each other. So the way that we add these screens to our tab bar controller is we actually control drag from our tab bar controller to our actual view controllers. You have to actually zoom in. And when we get this little modal over here, we select under relationship segue, we do view controllers. So I control drag from the tab bar controller to our view controller, and the segue we're selecting is view controllers under relationship segue.
Did you have to do it in chapter 1 also?
Yep, I'm doing that too. Well, chapter 1 we embedded into our, yeah. So we have each of our tabs, right? But we don't have our labels at the bottom. So if you double click at the bottom over here, it should let us select the bar so we can set the name. So one thing that's kind of counterintuitive, you think that you set all the menu items over here and you point them to the right view controller. You actually set the name of the tab bar and the icon of the tab bar in each respective view controller. There we go. So I'll call this, let's change our application from a book to something that's a bit more single level as opposed to like linear page levels. So we'll create, let's create a music player. So we have a music section, we have a player section, and we have a preferences section. So I'll change this one to music. I'll change the label to music just so we have context here. Let's go ahead and remove this. It'll be kind of difficult to read, this bottom part over here. I'm sorry?
What kind of element again? What type of element? Down there.
So this is actually part of the tab bar control, so that adds the tab bar. You can either click it over here, or you can go to your attribute inspector and change the title to music, because it's a bit difficult to select on here. So select the tab bar, and then attribute inspector, and then we can change the title. So let's do this for all of our screens. I'll create the second one, call this player, and change the tab bar name to player. Yeah, so we're now renaming our tabs. So we're doing is selecting the tab and then changing the name. So if you select tab and go to your attribute inspector, you can change the title. The other way is to double click it, but it's a bit tough to select the item over here.
So click on
Oh, yeah,
the item
click on
first,
it.
and then click at the very bottom.
And I'll just call it the last screen settings and remove the button. So we have music, player, and settings. And we have a label for each one of them, and then the label and the tab bar has the appropriate name as well.
So change here. What you're saying, click here.
Also, select click, double click. There we go. Or you can change it from right there. I think it's probably Xcode box. If you click on the tab bar, and then go to the attribute inspector.
What about you click here and see if you actually have
Tab bar, yeah. So you do have the bar button.
if you click on the button item, shouldn't that select it?
It should select it. Xcode now.
Okay.
Yeah. Xcode is not in our favor today. Don't reset, leave it as is for now.
There too.
Yeah,
Yeah, I will do that. What might have happened is you might have dragged a bar button controller into that new controller, and you might have maybe resized it or hidden it, and it might have confused it when you dragged from the tab bar to that because there's already a bar button in there.
So isn't that another con of using storyboard? You build like some funky stuff in the story.
Well, you have large screen part of the issue. You also have, I mean, there's bugs regardless. This is a bug.
So the following is can select the. Yeah.
It's about it raise your stuff and load it again. I don't know what's going on.
So I think I'm going to take on this for you. I read through it, I read through it, so that I see the brands that they're setting.
Yeah.
So we kind of just.
So now.
I'd say just running this.
Layer.
Just wait to double check this. You were. I don't understand. Navigation control.
Navigation control is all linear, right? So they keep going on top of the sequence back on top of it. This is all
So
randomized.
here,
So you go from page 1 to page 3 or page 2.
the first one is sequential, and this one is.
And there's no backbone, it's just the first one, last one, second one, wherever we go. And they come in and out.
Right, and the fact that, for example, we got a player here and then we type it back. Why are we doing here? This is just right. Oh, this is what we have. That's this is.
Yeah,
I have a lot of.
Yeah. Oh, no, no, no.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Did I say today?
Did you listen to me? No, it's kind of review, so.
So I'm just gonna see that I do this right. But I'm not sure I got it right. Yeah.
So we'll actually spend a month doing this, the rest of the class.
When you run because after I got your response about the text fields not doing what the labels do, I changed them.
Sure.
Yeah. That's not the way buttons do. They're not. They're actually just the button that I got.
Yeah.
Cool. And I saw you added slides for Lesson03, right?
I did.
Yeah.
When I had turned this around, creating one thing, and then I pushed that, I pushed it to my class, right, to add this, and then you can feel that. And then when I somewhere pull it through,
Exactly. If you're local,
right,
and then you push that into your origin.
when I pull it from you, I'm like, different. And then there's always a master and then original. Does it matter what I pull from when it's on upstream already?
You're always gonna pull from master, upstream just location, but it's also gonna be the master.
And then when I push to
Origin.
origin.
Yeah. But you're always staying on master in our context. So master is brand.
Oh.
That's that. Right, so let's say, let's say I just finished modifying.
Never click on there because all it does is show history of those different things. Okay. So you're always gonna work with your master all the way through the working copy. So these are the only things you're ever clicking on, unless you mention but so
So actually, I just my class needed that is what I thought I messed up with Xcode, and I wanted to use the version before that I had already pushed up. How would I do that?
let's talk after.
We're gonna get to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's the main goal of having the.
Exactly. Social actually makes it pretty easy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So yeah, I that's a lot of one thing. So I think it's because you actually had, yeah, you already had this in there. So Xcode is locking it for us. So what I would do is I would just for now, I'll remove this and add another view controller. And you guys,
So that it covers everything. It's gonna do that now. I got that.
I started just being really buggy today. So any questions on tab bars right now?
I like them.
They're fun. So let's actually modify it a little bit more. Right now we have the option to change the label, and mine is being really buggy. It's not letting us see the label I changed it to. So if I run this, we will see that we have the names of the tabs, but we don't have the images, right? So tab bars usually have images associated with them.
Like little icons.
Little icons, exactly. So look at the storyboard, and we see that we have all of our screens, right? And if I click between all of our screens, it takes us to the appropriate view, right? So let's go ahead and add icons to our tabs. If you pull up the class repository, you will see under resources a folder named icons. So resources, icons. And we'll share a lot of icons with you guys as the class goes on. These aren't all free ones. There's tons of free resources. This specific icon set we're using is called Glyph icons. Is everyone here right now? Under resources, icons? So in our next code, let's right-click under Storyboards Demo. And let's create a new group. Again, remember, groups are like folders. They help us add hierarchy between our files and relationships. And we'll call this icons. And then in our folder, let's select all of the PNGs. So if you click on the first item, scroll to the bottom, hold down Shift, and select everything. Everyone have this? Let's drag and drop this into our icons folder or icons group in Xcode. And make sure you have copy items if needed selected. Does everyone remember what that means? Why do we select copy items if needed?
Because it copies all those icons in your actual project as opposed to just remembering where they're located in your hard drive.
Exactly. Yep. So we're selecting this because if we don't have this, they just become shortcuts, references to your actual icons. And if you remove them from your computer, you no longer have access to them. So if you have it selected, it just copies everything to your project. So we see all the files added to our icons group. Does everyone get this? And now Xcode knows that we have these images in our application, in our accessible in our application. So we can actually go in our tab. Select the tab, and then under the attributes inspector, we can actually go and select the image. So you have access to everything that we added over here. So I'm just going to add some randomness for now. I'll do a hammer for that one. The player.
How does it know to look at that icons group when you select the image? In other words, I clicked on there and I expected to have to choose something, but
It knows that all the images are in your project, so it gives you access to all those
it's just
images.
pulling every PNG.
Yep. Yep.
They would check out. They would review.
When the stars
This is
is,
because there's folders right here, they were starting to here.
It's all.
That's all one side. Yeah.
So that's what right now.
Yeah.
Your visual.
Yes.
Eyes initially control.
So for the player, squiggle. So they're totally random. And now we have icons for all of our tabs.
Yeah, sure, she said,
Yeah.
We still, we're having this settings.
Okay. Yeah, next one is not in our favorite thing. So best practices. Do we have? Can we have? Should we have tab views, tab bars embedded within items that are deep in our navigation controller? No, right? So best practice is that these cover entire sections, and we can have navigation items, linear relationships, within each one of these sections. However, best practice, you can, but best practice is you should not have items that are very deep in our navigation that have tab bars, right? Because these act as main representations of our application. So we can and should have navigation controllers within our tab bar controllers, but not vice versa. Do you have questions on it? Yeah.
I'm getting in there.
As far as number of items over here, we can have up to 5. If you have any more, the last icon should be a more button that gives us more options. But as far as number of items we can fit in here, we can have up to 5. And that's because we can each icon, each tab bar is 44 points high and is usually square. So if you have spacing between 5, that will usually hit the maximum limit, the maximum number of space you have between the whole screen size. Yeah.
And so if you design for iPad, is it closer to 8 or is it still?
And then you want to
It's still 5. You can technically fit more for 8, but best practice for iOS is you have 5. If you have any more than 5, you should think your architecture.
So regardless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like change the title.
So I heard you refer to this a couple times already. You referred to size as rather than pixels.
Yeah.
Is there a difference or is it the same thing?
I have all.
There's a difference, right? Because different devices. Yeah, so that's actually an excellent question. The question was, what's the difference between points and pixels? So each new iOS device has a different screen density, right? And screen density means number of pixels you can fit on the screen. So if we're to go by pixels, these sizes will be different for everything, for every iOS device, because pixel density changes between every device. Whereas points is kind of a set number that it's a ratio, exactly. Yeah.
I just this week read like a really good blog post about this. I can throw it in the links.
That would be awesome, please. Yeah. Weekly Slack.
Recently, I've been seeing apps without the labels at the bottom, just the icon. How do you the labels?
How do you what? Remove the labels?
I've been seeing apps where there are no words at the bottom of the tab, it's just the icon.
You can delete the label, but you want to ask yourself, is it really good practice?
Yeah,
If you delete those, that's frustrating.
If you were to delete the label, but using whatever that thing name? Can you give it a name?
So it might just be photo and it will just lay in the thing.
But you can't hide it, you can't make the item have a, like a.
You can do a
name, or
custom
you-
name.
like a.
Yes, you can actually do that. You slowly click on it in the sidebar.
If there's no label, you don't have to worry about changing language.
That's a good point. Yes, that's an excellent point. Yeah, there's no label for about language. Plus, Instagram is widely adopted enough that they've kind of created their own culture. You can certainly get away. There's icons that are, that are pretty widely adopted, like the camera. You don't necessarily have to explain the camera, but if I remove music here, and I just had a hammer, what the hell does that mean?
That's aggressive.
From a standpoint of section 508, I mean, you have the concern, not that a lot of visual examples use iPhone anyway, but is there a read aloud text function for people who have, in other words, is it tying to accessibility?
Yes, there it is.
Yeah, there is.
Accessible, iPhone's are the most accessible platform
Yeah,
out there.
that's great.
So if you remove the label, what's it gonna say, camera image?
No, you have.
It's like hammer image.png, but you can change the accessibility level
Yeah.
deeper into the
Oh,
iOS.
okay.
You can see it.
Okay.
That means you better not name your icon like something crap number 1, crap number 2.
Or worse.
Yeah, Apple makes things very accessible.
So, question, because you talked about, if you put more than 5 items, basically you have a more button that pops up. So if in storyboard I create, let's say, those 7 different screens, will it automatically create that more button? Do I need to do something to create that more button?
You need to do something. We're going to cover that because that can be pretty flexible. We're going to cover that once we go into code a bit more.
And is the only way to change the order that they appear to delete the segues and recreate them?
Yeah, you just rearrange the order they use the select the segues for. Yeah,
It seems like they appear in the order that I created.
yeah, exactly.
Is there a way to number the segues or the item? Because I'm not sure I understand what this means, but there's always an integer or boolean, integer value that you can select, like a 0, 1, 2.
Or
If, for example, I click on settings here. There's the tag, sorry.
Yeah.
Does this make it?
no, it doesn't. Yeah, it's something else.
All right. And there is no way of numbering them. Just for
Not
the sake
from
of the
interface
order.
builder, right? Yeah, not from interface builder. You can
Drag them around.
You can drag them around, yeah. But not in terms of the attribute inspector.
That's perfect.
Excellent questions. So any more questions before we go to activity? What's the difference between a storyboard and a nib?
Storyboard demonstrates the relationships between screens.
Yeah, so a nib has only one screen, whereas storyboard is multiple. Why would I use a nib over a storyboard? Reusable items, templates, reusable views. What are some cons of storyboards? Reusability.
Well, they're kind of limited. I mean, if where you're trying to be better, they're good. But if you're trying to do something very specific,
Yeah. So it's kind of like what you said, right? Reusability and being able to. They can be certainly dynamic, but being able to reuse certain scenes, it makes it quite more difficult.
As your storyboards get more intricate, you're like running it over and over again every time. You know what I mean? To see if it works versus looking at what you've gotten and then individually.
Sort of. I mean, storyboards make kind of seeing what's going on easier. But you also have to think about your layouts as well and your architecture and how things are connected. So a lot of times, if you have a whole bunch of stuff going back and forth, you've got to think about what the use case is and why it's doing that. And a lot of that will start clicking a bit more when we start presenting our views programmatically. But essentially, storyboards help us just have a clear bird's eye view of how our things are functioning.
also teamwork needs are better than storyboard because you can each work on your different needs.
Yeah, theoretically, I mean, quite honestly, I've worked in plenty of projects where people share storyboards, and I haven't really run. Have you?
There's one conflict, which is Xcode changes one number in the top of the storyboard every time, which is the reverse conflict of this.
It's really easy to fix. Other than that, I don't really. Yeah, I can see how, and I have run into some issues before, but it's not as common as you think.
We create separate storyboards for every different scene. So there's one for like section fronts and then one for articles. It reduces the
Yeah, exactly. So you can have multiple storyboards depending on the job to be done. We're not gonna cover it today, but you can certainly have as many storyboards as you need. Cool. So why don't we take like a 5-minute break, and let's do the week 1 assessment. Pair up and do it together, and turn them in by the end of class or by the end of the week. Then the other ones will be working on as homework. I just want us to get in the groove of pulling the homework in, working together so we can kind of get in the flow of the first project, and then submit it by the end of class, ideally. So the assessment is on GitHub under assessments and week 1, and you'll have the directions. So MobDC, assessments, week 1. And then the assignment is your directions, and the rubric is the grading rubric. So let's pair up. This one won't be a pair programming exercise because there's not much programming going on. But pick a partner to have as a reference when you're building this. And you will have to, for some of these requirements, search for the attribute inspector. Like it asks you to, for example, have a password field and mask the password field. We generally go through that together, but it's in the attribute inspector on your utility, on the right side of the bar. So search for that if you have issues. Either call me or Stuart or your partner. But you will have to do a bit of digging to change some of the attributes for the text fields for the assignment.
I thought that was the one.
Yeah, so no, we said the first assignment is not going to be homework. Starting the next one, we're going to start working on them individually. But this first one, just to get in the flow of things, we're going to work on it collectively.
This is what I.
Yeah. So take a break, stretch out if you need to, before you jump into work.
I think that's one of the first half hour on your explanation on NIMS.
Okay, yeah. So I can show you. It can be used as such. The purpose of this class, we're just calling them reusable items. So they can be elements or they can be raw. So if you go through that stuff, and then click on main group. So, and then go to new file. And then go to details to work. And view.
So
just follow that.
So when I create, right, then the only view control that I have.
So this essentially creates another view for us. It's very similar to storyboard, like you can only have one view.
So
And it works
so
in
we
terms of
single
dragging elements and they're the same.
you
But the difference with storyboard is we call this storyboard.
well, so yeah, if I have a text field,
So like many kind of, yeah.
If I was to go
Sure.
The schedule. is
Very
very
similar
couldn't
to
be
class.
the same.
So that's the main difference. We're not gonna be using it for,
You know, more than, so when I click on it, every second.
just know that it's a reusable item.
Okay, so
Some of you.
all the menu was from this space, so keyboard.
And before we had storyboard, everything came for and it's available.
And this is the
Files.
So here, the problem, I'm writing this, right? I need to program it. Where do I program it?
So,
So now, can I create a view control and then hide?
I mean, well, those actually work in that.
Yeah.
Add-on. It's a class you like.
Yes.
That is. What is it?
Yeah, I was just
experimenting.
Okay, so. Okay, there's no more for these here.
This is actually going to be.
It's class side.
Because I find out today, found out like
No, so
You want to work together?
Yeah.
There's gonna be mirror each other.
Oh, okay, got it. So we're both doing it.
Exactly, so.
Yeah, and then open up. So it's a new file.
Lesson 01. Navigate.
So this basically brings up the system that so this lets you enter the code. Now we I just do the so it doesn't know
That's
what
what
I'm first recommended Friday that they don't get to that. Students were not about this next week.
We'll need to
Go back. But yeah, that's correct. That's extra.
At the end, some people do 70. Navigate exhibit builder. You have storyboard. Create a login screen with 2 text boxes on it. Okay, so it's.
Summer, I guess it's called.
Yeah.
Okay, I always do these in here.
So,
Yeah, love it. Yeah, it's great.
And this is what.
I'm talking about. Next one,
Yeah. So I can figure out what the problem is. But then I noticed that the exit was working. And.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can come from background and JavaScript. You can make it. Yeah, and technically you can do this. You can do this sort too. It's not good to make.
Yeah.
Nor should you.
Okay.
Is that a label now?
No.
Oh, no.
I think one of the requirements was scroll down.
Sure, there's a point.
Okay, no, that's actually, that's good.
Oh, that was necessary.
Yeah, that was necessary. Yeah, that's right.
You said there's a file for speech story.
Yes, that's what the expert project is, because it just has the main screen, the login screen. So you can start a new project and then make a screen, or you can just work on that one. But make sure that if you work on that one, you copy it to your own personal folder. It's actually a good question. And guys, make sure that when you pull the assessment file, you don't work on it in that folder, because remember, you only want to work on files on your own folder so it doesn't conflict when you pull from upstream. So if you're going to work on the week 1 assessment, make sure you copy that into your own homework folder.
That's okay.
Okay. So I have it in assessment, should I copy paste it?
Yeah, so click on it. And
Yeah. So one of the things we did was we created a home folder and aggregated origin info. So yeah. So it doesn't conflict with
So look, okay.
Yep.
I already have them. Okay. So I just have it.
Is it hard to make or?
Documentary.
I have a commentary. Why don't I just?
Yeah. Yeah, on the origin, just because if you edit the same file,
So I'm gonna close. Alright, I'm gonna close the project, correct? You want me to reverse the same? Or is that gonna bring back? Great.
what did you do now?
I just.
So,
it
because
was
they
just
can,
one I convert to save this back.
Oh,
Very
very
good.
good.
So
So
then you get
it does go back to.
Oh.
Assessments.
Oh.
Yeah, I just don't know.
So right
She's
now,
on her
what I will do, make the most full version, you copy the file, and then
So
just
can you help her, she did when she worked on the origin phone, when she was creating new folder on homework.
So I guess,
I pulled it off my,
It's in your fork, but when you pull from upstream.
That's good, yes.
Okay, well, it's your files, because origin file.
Are you pulling
I
out
was working in here.
after you create?
No.
click on installation save. Under your home. Right, find out here. Okay, so it's cool. Yes, so it's all right there.
Just extra project.
Well, you just.
Yeah.
Now we have to say that.
No, just.
Yes, exactly.
There's two text boxes. Lisa, right?
This is just a text field.
No, I'm trying to create a home.
All you need to do is,
How do you say?
the login is just, and then again, segues. one thing that I.
Drag it to your home.
Yeah.
So here, because you have the right. So I just renamed those to.
No.
Those should get another screen.
I just, now I did say, oh,
And that was wrong. Because you're saying is. Yes, but that's, but right now it's under the,
Yeah.
so yeah, that was.
But then just pull it
Oh,
down
that's
to-
the-
Because other people have writing this file and they decide to do is if you want to show. Yes.
Leaving it in class.
Yeah, because the SSG before you make the right stuff.
So you have your folders.
Okay, so you said.
Sunday class breaks.
yeah, I just.
You so there was just basically when we have there is a an attribute over here where
I raise your hand because I don't want you to move the unclick those and the user can't.
so whatever thing
Access fields.
yeah, so when I open your app on my iPhone. Yeah, and if I click symbols, then I can do anything with it. It's like just right, and you don't want it to be other, exactly, that's the word that I should use. So, yes, yeah, and, so when you run this now that.
And that's not like on this whole world.
Next under.
Right.
First,
regular.
I just want to assessments.
Yeah.
Assessments.
Yeah,
Then I did
those files, right?
I know, but then I did
That's exactly what we did.
I think that you.
So I just essentially copied it.
And this is.
And put it in a copy.
So it's getting shifted to the right. Yes. I don't know why. I'll maybe an hour. That's just like, what am I gonna do with you? So, with all your questions in mind, I could search. But it didn't. So, yeah, just here, so, okay, we're always consistent. And the way I have one, so. I think of that, but I don't want to run it by, I think it's about a completely different. It's like one foot, because the equals that I have to use, I didn't get back, that's the thing that it needs. But all of
You want to say
you.
okay.
So now.
So like, so they